kiddos. So today we are going to talk about the Constitution and the Federalist era. So we are going to start with the presidency of George Washington and his predecessor, John Adams. And we're going to look at different domestic and foreign issues that they each have to look at, and how that will culminate into this kind of like political division. And how Americans view the role of government, which is a continuity in American history. And at this point, it's going to result in the creation of a two-party system, which also kind of relates to today. This division that is kind of created will also end in this revolution in 1800 with Thomas Jefferson being elected president. And so we're going to kind of talk about the different issues that kind of got us to that turning point in American history in 1800. So first, let's kind of set the scene a little bit. Let's talk about the context for which Washington is unanimously elected by the Electoral College for president. He was obviously a leader during the Revolutionary War, even a leader, like a diplomatic leader in the First and Second Continental Congress. He was someone that just kind of exuded these leadership qualities. And when they wrote, when James Madison kind of wrote Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it's almost like they had George Washington in mind when you think of a commander-in-chief. But they're also thinking about weaknesses of the articles, in which why you would need an executive branch and a military. And that goes back to the Revolutionary War and the difficulty that they faced in properly funding and supporting troops. And so they knew that needed to be play a strong role in a larger centralized government. And so Washington comes in, and one of the first precedents that he established, because there's a lot of responsibility when you are the first president. There isn't anything like this in the world at this point in time. Like today, we have prime ministers and presidents all over the world. This is a first, whereas an elected head of state, normally they are monarchs. And so he knew that he wanted to do things differently. He also knew that he was not an expert on all of the different things that a president would need to take into account in order to kind of make executive decisions. And so one of the things that he did is he did create this first cabinet coming from like advisors, like to the king. So that word is similar there. And that's what they are. The cabinet are advisors. And it's kind of like when you look at his first cabinet, so he created 3 executive departments, or 4, I guess. But you have the Secretary of State, who they deal with foreign issues, and that was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson during the Revolutionary War was in France and kind of lobbied and helped with that. The Secretary of War is Henry Knox, who was also one of the generals during the Revolutionary War and trusted confidant of Washington. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury. He's been fairly popularized lately, played a major role in our founding, I would say the success of our founding. There is a musical that is dedicated in his honor and numerous biographies, and he's super complex and really interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about him later. And then you have your first Attorney General. So the Attorney General is the person that looks at the legality, right? So they use the Constitution and kind of basically advises the president whether or not what the administration is doing is legal or within the Constitution or not, okay? And again, this is brand new. This is the most difficult part about a revolution, is establishing a government that can withstand the test of time. The Articles of Confederation failed that test. And we as a nation were really lucky that we just didn't fall into a totalitarian type government or somewhere that could seize power. And that's where Washington plays a really important role in this, is because he loved this country. He was honorable. He was noble. He led by example, and that made Americans both like anti-federalists and federalists at that time period, both feel confident in him as their leader. When you think of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they had different political views at this point in time, and they're going to move further and further away from one another. But they both trusted Washington. And that's what a leader, and that's why, you know, when you look at the office of the presidency, it isn't about necessarily, you know, legislation, because that is designated to the Congress with Article 1. The role of the president is to be a leader and kind of be a leader to all Americans. And remember that he serves all Americans, whether you agree with him politically or not. And so one of the first things that takes place during his presidency is the Judiciary Act. Article 3 was very vague. And even if you look at Article 3 in the Constitution, it is the shortest. It did outline kind of a Supreme Court, and it talked about like chief justices and at this point 5 associate justices. But what they wanted to do was, and one of the first things they did with the Judiciary Act, and this is Congress, is that they created a system of district courts and court of appeals. And so, for example, like if you hear the phrase, like it worked its way up through the Supreme Court. So like in civics, if they said like, oh, and it made its way up to the Supreme Court, it starts at a federal like district level. If it's a federal issue, it has to be a federal issue. Typically, it has something to do with the Constitution, right? Because otherwise states have certain laws. And it would make its way up. Let's say that you didn't like the verdict in one case, you could file for grounds of an appeal, and then you can make your way up through the appellate court system. And that the Judiciary Act set up all of that. Okay, so first law of Congress, it is important. But where we're getting to the real importance of this this chapter in particular, this time period, is really going to revolve around this man, Alexander Hamilton, and his economic plan. You might also see it as financial plan. You can use those interchangeably. So during the years of the Articles of Confederation, before the U.S. Constitution, after the Treaty of Paris, like the Revolutionary War is over. Remember that under the Articles, each state had its own debt. It had, because there was no centralized government during the Revolutionary War. So like Massachusetts had war debt, and Virginia had war debt, and South Carolina had war debt. And under the Articles, it was very difficult to be able to trade with other countries because they basically saw the United States as weak. The states weren't paying back their debt. And so if you can't pay back your debt, you're not very well trusted. And maybe other countries don't want to trade with you or borrow from you or you know, loan you money. And so that was one of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, really why you don't see many nations like I don't even know if there are any where it's just a confederation, is it lacks that legitimacy to where foreign nations would want to do business with you. And so the biggest issue that faced the nation, fast forward at this point in time, with Washington was, we have to handle this situation. Now, Alexander Hamilton, you might know, if you know anything about the musical, he was born in Nevis. It's an island, British island. He was, his mother, basically his father was kind of like a traveling merchant, and so he didn't really have a father figure. So there's like a derogatory word where they were called a bastard, an illegitimate relationship. His mother dies, his brother dies, on Nevis, the island of Nevis, and he basically has to grow up really quickly. And he was brilliant, and he loved to read, and he got his hands on books, and he was kind of self-taught. And eventually the people of this island, because they are so impressed with him, and he works along the docks and works for different merchants and things, and is just this brilliant mind. They basically, it's like your first GoFundMe, right? They raise enough funds to send him to New York to King's College, which will become Columbia University. And there is where he starts to pursue a degree and eventually a law degree. He enlists in the Continental Army, and he makes his way, because of this brilliant mind, makes his way up to Washington. Really is like Washington's, you know, in the musical, like his right-hand man during the war. And it's interesting because even though he comes from this very humble background, this immigrant, did not grow up with privilege, he definitely viewed the future of the country in kind of like an elitist way. And when I say elitist, it means mostly like the people with knowledge. Well, the people that have knowledge and education are going to be wealthy at this point, uh, even kind of today to a certain extent, right? If you're able to afford higher education. And he also believed that the future of the country had to be focused on trade and commerce. So kind of that New Englander, New York City, and he lived in New York City, kind of looked at agrarian economy as somewhat backwards, even though that was vital to trade. And so he is given this task of, you got to figure out the debt. His goal was to encourage a commercial and industrial economies. To remember that the Navigation Acts prevented Boston or Philadelphia or New York from having factories that would have competed with London's factories. So he's kind of tasked with that. Like, how do we, because that's very expensive, how do we encourage that infrastructure or invest in that infrastructure and kind of help companies create these things, these factories? And so to achieve some sort of economic stability. And he comes up with this plan. This is how we're going to achieve these goals. This is how we're going to become not even like an economic like power, but just like, this is how we're going to keep our head above water and be able to trade with other countries. The first thing is the assumption of all state debt, meaning that there's no longer Virginia debt and Massachusetts debt. It is now the United States' debt, okay? He wanted to sell bonds. So if you think of like a war bond, like, so basically it's a loan, but it's cash in hand, right? So I give you a piece of paper. I say that this is a bond. I'll tell you the interest and what it pays out and over a course of years. So you give me $10 now, 20 years from now, I'll give you $100, whatever it might be. Okay. But that way, if you get $10 from each of these people, you have enough money to start kind of paying down that debt, the assumed national debt. He also wanted to impose excise taxes. So an excise tax is on whiskey, for example. So it's like on products. We think of them today as like, it's things that people are going to buy no matter what. And so you put a tax on it in order to raise revenue. So some people call them sin taxes, gas, alcohol, cigarettes. Like, there are certain taxes that no matter how high the tax you raise on it, people are probably still going to buy those goods. Okay. That's an excise tax. A tariff is and this is so important. Like, I cannot stress enough to you that you understand what a tariff is, because it's going to play a really large role in economic policy for sure the antebellum period, because it's going to be divisive, but as well into kind of like the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Even today, tariffs are something that you've probably heard in the news, and kind of this discussion if we should raise tariffs in order to promote American industry. And that's exactly what it was designed to do. Hamilton's idea was and this is something that I always do in class, so I guess I should do it now, right? The idea is that if this pink pen is produced in England, now England has had factories for decades by this point. The infrastructure is there, the process is there, it cuts costs. When you can cut costs, you can sell your product for cheaper, and therefore you can market it to more people, sell more, right? So the cost of this pen is lower than the cost of the American pen, okay? The American pen is, we don't have the process down quite right yet. It's more expensive. Like today, it's more expensive because we have labor laws, right? We have minimum wage and things like that. Whereas if you go to other parts of the world, they don't have those things, so they can cut those costs. So the argument today is, well, we don't have a lot of American manufacturing because it's cheaper to make things other places. And so what has been proposed by the most recent, by the Trump administration was, well, if we raise taxes on this good, right, on the foreign good, now Americans, it'll be cheaper, right, to buy the American good. But keep in mind that the cost is going to go up no matter what. Americans pay that tax. Tariffs is not something that governments pay. It is a tax that is put on Americans. Now, the good side is that you do get American industry should increase. It definitely did during this time period, right? So the purpose of a tariff is to promote Americans buying American-made goods instead of foreign goods, okay? And there are going to be complications with that today because of globalization and because in the 20th century there was a decrease in tariffs to promote global trade, and it has to do with the world wars and all of that. But because of that, we've kind of gotten used to these low prices. What we've also gotten used to really since the 1960s and 70s, and even in the 1990s, as late as the 1990s, is that a lot of manufacturing is left. And so certain states like Wisconsin, Michigan, kind of that Rust Belt, Indiana, they have really struggled financially because they've lost a lot of the manufacturing. And we as Americans have to be prepared that, like, if we were to raise taxes in order to get more American-made goods, we just have to be prepared that that is going to be offset, that cost is offset on the consumer. So you will pay higher prices for those things, okay? And the reason I took so much time to explain that is because it's extremely important in understanding what a tariff is, and we'll talk about it in class. The creation of a national bank and a set currency will also be a part of his goal, and again, that just kind of brings some legitimacy, okay? Now, early on, a lot of people had issues with this. We'll call them anti-federalists for this period of time. In particular, Thomas Jefferson was one of his outspoken critics. And they didn't really like the idea of, for example, Massachusetts had a lot of debt, and they had kept that debt, whereas some of the southern states who did have less debt, Revolutionary War debt, had paid theirs off. Okay, so that was one of the issues. They had an issue with lumping everybody's debt together and then putting taxes, which we already know how Americans feel about taxes, right? And that's centralized government. Then putting taxes where we're paying it off. So they saw it that as Southerners and rural people, farmers saw it as you're raising taxes on us to help northern states that, you know, or things that benefit you, Alexander Hamilton, and your New York City slickers. Okay, so that was kind of the view. The other reason that people like Thomas Jefferson and his supporters, and I'm not using a political party yet because we don't really have political parties. There are factions, but not a two-party system quite yet. But supporters of Jefferson and critics of Hamilton's plan also said, I understand what you're saying about these tariffs and that it'll promote American trade. But if you are a rural farmer in Pennsylvania, or in South Carolina, or in Virginia, or Maryland, or New York, rural farmer, if the way that you earn money has nothing to do with industry, and industry in particular, the only thing that you're going to see is the cost of the things that you need to buy in order to make your farm work. So it's the seeds or the equipment, or just like your day-to-day supplies. All of those things are going to go up in price. However, you're not going to get a kickback like the people in the cities and the factories are, right? You raise taxes, there's more industry, there are more jobs, maybe higher wages, and you see that in those cities like New York. But in Virginia, according to Jefferson, like, there's no benefit. So you in the cities are benefiting from at the expense of the farmers and rural America, okay? And so what we have here is this first example of an urban-rural divide in our country. And really, when you look at the heart of political division today, to a certain extent, it is an urban-rural divide versus like a north-south thing. And you'll even see, like, when we look at the electoral map a little bit later on, you'll notice that most Federalists lived in like urban areas or coastal areas because that's where all of the trade is done. And the further west you move, or the more rural you move, or states that are mostly rural or agrarian, are going to fall within kind of the Democratic Republican Party. Okay, so there's a disagreement over this, and Congress is kind of looking to Thomas Jefferson as their kind of like a leader within that faction, and James Madison, who is the author of the Constitution. And they're kind of looking to him as whether or not they should vote, because Congress, like Hamilton writes it, right, and he proposes it. However, Congress has to approve of it. And a lot of former anti-federalists, supporters of Jefferson, are skeptical, and they're looking to him like, should we do this or not? And Jefferson was against it. But Hamilton and Washington knew that it needed to be done. By the way, Jefferson will later say that it was a very smart decision and that he was wrong about the plan for kind of criticizing it, but he did get something out of it. Here's how politics kind of works. There's a compromise. They did lower the tariff a little bit, but the biggest thing, one of Jefferson's biggest concerns was that, because at this point the capital is in New York City. Okay, it moved from Philadelphia to New York, so Washington was sworn in New York City. And so that means that all of the representatives, the senators and the congressional representatives, were going to New York City, and that's where they lived and that's where they worked. And one of Jefferson's concerns was that people, these that represent these rural districts, are going to get swept up in this big city life, and they're going to forget the people that they represent back home. And so actually it was Washington's proposal was, what if we move the capital from New York further south, and in particular to this piece of land called Foggy Bottom on the Potomac River, kind of squeezed in between Maryland and Virginia. And it's closer to like Thomas Jefferson's home. James Madison was a Virginian. Washington actually, Mount Vernon is on the Potomac River. And that was the compromise, was let's move the capital south in a place where, New York City slickers can know what real America is, that they have like a reminder that they are representing all Americans, not just their interests. And the same thing for the more rural representatives in southern states, is that remember where you came from and remember those people and their interests. Okay, which is interesting because you even hear that phrase today, like, so-and-so has been in Washington they've forgotten their roots, and they're disconnected, and they talk about like Washington elite. And so it's interesting that was a concern at that point in time, but also keep in mind how, like, right now, like, we're like, what, an hour and a half plane ride to DC, maybe like a 4 or 5 hour drive. Back then it would take you weeks to get to Washington, DC. And so you didn't come home as often. And so you could have that disconnect. So that's the compromise, is that they move the capital to the District of Columbia. And it's this, it was originally like this diamond type, and it's sovereign, it's separate. Like, for example, they don't get to, like, they don't have representation in Congress. DC doesn't. I recently, not this year, but the year before, I was selected to be, or I should say, in 2019, I was selected to be a part of the White House History Teacher Institute. And so I got to go to DC, and I learned a lot about the formation of the district and kind of the negotiations of everything. And it was fascinating. I learned a ton, and I would geek out and talk about it forever if I could. Okay, so those things were very important. And so I did take a lot of time with those. Hamilton's plan, and then kind of like Washington's cabinet, because the tension between Hamilton and Jefferson, keep in mind, right, they are sitting in the cabinet, like and again, this is why Hamilton the musical is really cool to use, because they work together every single day, and they really did not like each other. Another issue that Jefferson challenged Hamilton on was the creation of a national bank. There are two different views that you can have in the Constitution, and this is really how two distinct parties are going to be developed. What should the size and scope of the federal government be? And then do you interpret the Constitution as strict, like word for word? And this was Jefferson's view, strict interpretation. What it says in the Constitution is what powers you are given, what powers you are not. And anytime you want to expand those powers, it needs to be a part of the amendment process, which is difficult to do. So like to amend the Constitution to allow this. So Hamilton had a more broad view, a loose interpretation, and he referenced the necessary and proper clause to do that. So you might have heard it as like the elastic clause, where it's like, you can kind of interpret and kind of, it's open to interpretation. Because Hamilton wanted to create a Bank of the United States. Now, the bank is separate. It's its own private entity. However, the federal government was the primary investor, so therefore primary, owner of it, right? So it's a private company, but the United States government is really like the primary shareholder of it, which means that they're using Americans' tax dollars to kind of own this bank. And Jefferson's like, whoa, like this has room to get super sketchy really quickly. Because remember, it's the people's money, right? So that means that it's the people's bank. And so if Jefferson had it his way, he would have proposed a constitutional amendment, to the U.S. Constitution, an amendment to add a national bank, not something that you could just interpret, which takes time and which is difficult. And like Hamilton didn't have the patience for that. He's like, no, let's just do this now. Let Congress pass it. Washington supported Hamilton, kind of irks Jefferson. We'll get more to that in a second. And again, it was kind of used in order to stimulate businesses, and it's where they kept the money. It's kind of like the Treasury. And so it's created, and it was basically given a charter where by 1816, that charter would run out. It's basically given kind of like these 20 or 30-year charters, depending on what Congress feels comfortable doing. And I say that because it's going to become important later on. But they argued over the bank and the constitutionality of it. Okay, foreign affairs, one more issue that creates division within Washington's cabinet. So the French people, the commoners, were inspired by the American Revolution and kind of taking liberty, right? So you have the French monarchy and the aristocrats, and that's where the concentration of wealth was, where everyone else is living in poverty. And so there's a French Revolution. And so not only was it a revolution within their own monarchy, but for whatever reason, they decided it would be a really good idea to declare war on all monarchies. So now they are at war with England. And Washington is put in this position, what does the president do when it comes to this? And do we aid one side or the other? Now, Jefferson came out, he was adamant from the very beginning. He's like, we need to support the French. We need to support them because they have created a republic. We need to support them because they helped us win our revolution from the British. And it's just a natural fit. That's what we need to do. Hamilton was hesitant because he said, whoa, slow your roll. Have you seen what the French have done to their country? And this is where that elitist thing kind of comes into play. So Jefferson is kind of this common man figure. And again, remember the little guy, remember the farmer, remember the rural people, remember the Southerners, even though they were a smaller percentage. And Hamilton was kind of this fear of this mobocracy, this could happen here if we allow these, if we show support towards these people that have invoked violence. And, this is the time of the guillotine. And so it kind of scared a lot of these wealthy elitists and educated people and people in high position, because they were scared that if they supported the French Revolution and these tactics, that the same thing could happen here. You've probably heard, in the news recently, you've heard of this mobocracy type mentality where you can't give in to the protesters and things like that, because then they'll just take over. And also Hamilton was hesitant to support the French. It was obvious to him, no, you shouldn't support the French, not only because of the way that they've gone about this and what that symbolizes and what could possibly happen here and that fear, but you also can't support the French because he had worked pretty hard to now improve trade relations back with Britain, okay? So even though they were kind of our enemy and we declared war and, won our independence, they weren't sour about that. They knew that they had to trade with us in order to support their economy, because remember how important and how vital the colonies were under mercantilism. And so the same principles here. It's just now that the United States has a little bit more they have ability to trade with more than one country now. So they don't have a monopoly on prices. So 80% of American trade is done with Britain at this point. And so, you know, Hamilton outlines those two reasons, like, no, we can't support the French. And so Washington's in this position. Now, keep in mind that Jefferson makes it clear that he's pro-French, Hamilton, pro-British. And they're looking at him like, what are you going to do? And Washington, in a brilliant, like, this is why you were the first president and why you will be one of the best presidents ever. He realizes the importance of that decision and he declares neutrality. Because, let's be honest, can the United States at this point in time, 1793, can the United States risk getting involved in another war? What if they're on the losing side? All of this work that they have fought for and died for and put more work in creating a government, all of that will be for nothing. And so he says, no, this is not this is not what we're going to do. We're going to declare neutrality. We will try to still trade with both countries, which is not really neutral, but he wanted to continue to trade with both countries or whoever would allow it. But he was not going to join or pick a political side. Okay. Jefferson's Secretary of State. He is the advisor on foreign policy. He has given the president his advice, and the president has chosen not to listen to him. And so he resigns because of it. Jefferson saw it as him picking Hamilton's side, maybe to a certain extent. I don't know. I think that he made the right decision, but Jefferson was very upset. So he did resign as Secretary of State in 1793. Okay. So really quickly, a couple other issues connected to the French Revolution. And most of these foreign issues that come up against for Washington and Adams have to do with the French Revolution. And it's because the French were kind of ticked off, right? They were like, hold on a second, like, you need to help us. And then the same thing with the British. And so one of the things that they did is they tested that neutrality. And so for the next, let's see, 20 years, for the next like 20 years, the French and the British are both going to test that neutrality by seizing merchant ships, right? So if you're trading or whatever, they'll attack your ship, and it kind of varied over the decades. But that was one of the things that they did. Citizen Genet is a situation where the French minister of the United States was trying to like recruit Southern help in order to go help the French. But really the biggest thing you need to know at this point in time is that England is seizing American merchant ships. And so the insurance on these ships is going up because they're losing all of the products that they're selling. And so it's throwing the economy into this like recession-like type thing, is what they were kind of going through. So Washington's like, okay, we need to fix this. Like, I've declared neutrality. They need to respect us, which we're still pretty young as a nation. So how do you demand that? So he sends John Jay. He was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It's not something today that would happen. Ideally, you would want to send your Secretary of State, but that's kind of a little awkward at this point. And so John Jay eventually, in order to maintain neutrality, in order for us to remain neutral and not be drawn into war, because that's what they're trying to do, is England's trying to draw us into war. Okay, maybe if they can draw us into the war, they can gain their territory back, and they can gain those natural resources back, and they can kind of have a more powerful economy than they currently have. And he negotiated basically not much of anything, but it did prevent us from going to war. But basically it said, hey, you know, you still have British troops in those forts that in the Northwest Territory that we gained with the Treaty of Paris. Like, they need to get out. And they're like, okay, that's fine. But the part about seizing American ships, nothing was done over that. Britain was like, if you don't want us to seize our ships, do something about it. Go ahead. And America was like, well, we can't. So, and so it was just kind of dropped. The Jay's Treaty was kind of seen to supporters of Jefferson, or we can start to call them Democratic Republicans. You might also, historians, to simplify it for you guys at the high school level, we call them Democratic Republicans so that you do not confuse them with the Republican Party of like Lincoln or even today. It's different. They were Democratic Republicans, so they were even though Jefferson called himself a Republican, and you'll see that in certain primary sources, just use it for now. You can use the term Democratic Republicans. They saw it as a slap in the face. They feel weak. They kind of want to they want to show force so that they don't feel like they're being taken advantage of, where Washington was more of a realist, and he said, you guys don't want to pick this fight. Like, we just need to stay out of this fight so that we can get stronger, so that when something really does have to happen where we do have to defend ourselves, we have the ability to do that. Paint Needs Treaty in 1796 opens up the Port of New Orleans as a trade factor. It also establishes like a border at the 31st parallel with Florida and Spain. Okay. Native American conflicts are going to take place really in the Ohio River Valley, like the Northwest Territory. So this little picture up here, this Chief Little Turtle, and I want to make sure that I include him because we always talk about Chief Little Turtle. He was of the Miami tribe, and he basically decided to create a confederacy. This is a continuity. So let's unite the Shawnee and the Delaware and the Iroquois tribes to come together with the Miami tribe, and they're going to create this confederacy, and they're going to fight back against U.S. expansion and Americans like moving into their territory. And they do. They win some victories. They defeat local militia. And so, let's use our new, executive branch and our military. And they go in. So the federal government comes in with troops, the federal army, and they defeat the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Battle of Fallen Timbers will lead to the Treaty of Greenville, where it basically, that land had been deemed with the Treaty of Paris with Britain as United States soil. But remember that the Native Americans weren't present at the Treaty of Paris. And so they still lived there and occupied it, and they considered it theirs. And so they rebelled. But this treaty, the Treaty of Greenville, is what solidifies it as American territory or U.S. territory with Native tribes. And so most of them end up moving west of the Mississippi River and kind of leaving that area because of it. And that's a continuity. Lots of treaties, lots of fighting, a lot of resistance with Native American tribes. One of the most divisive events of the time period, and one that I highly suggest you understand, is the Whiskey Rebellion. So in 1794, some Pennsylvania farmers refused to pay the excise tax on whiskey. So remember that in Pennsylvania, they're your breadbasket. They grow corn and wheat and rye. Remember, though, that you can use corn for whiskey. And so that's some of the things that they did. So they would sell their corn as like a cash crop, but then they could also use excess corn to sell to like whiskey distillers, or think of like moonshining. It wasn't moonshining because it was all like regulated. And so if you have to pay a tax on the alcohol, like the whiskey, the corn farmers were upset about this. And so they even went around shouting no taxation without representation. Like the Sons of Liberty, they attacked tax collectors. And this is a problem because unlike the time of the Revolutionary period, they had representation, right? They had representation in the House of Representatives. They had representation in the Senate. Those two bodies approved of these taxes. What they didn't like is that maybe their side lost out, right? But they had representation. And so Washington was very clear, the Constitution, we had checks and balances. If you don't like the way that your representatives vote, or if you don't like the way that the Congress votes, then you have to kind of step up and, it's just part of the democratic process. But just because your side lost doesn't mean that you can rebel. And we have this example. You really need to try and compare it to Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a very similar situation. They're upset about Massachusetts taxes. These were state taxes. They were upset about the number of people that were put in debt because of an economic downturn. And so the debt led to prison sentences and fines and things. And so with Shays' Rebellion, they revolted and they rebelled, and Massachusetts wasn't able to put it down very effectively. Now, or today, if something like that happens, there's lots of protests in different states. So, in the summer of 2020 in Portland, Oregon, there were, riots and protests where federal troops are brought in, or the National Guard is brought in to help help support the states. Sometimes not even being wanted by the state. But anyways, so here's an example of Washington's. And so with Shays' Rebellion, there was no federal government, there was no military, there was no National Guard to come in and help Massachusetts put down that rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion was one of the reasons why Washington was like, we need to rework it. We need to get rid of the articles, and we need a stronger constitution, a stronger centralized government to prevent rebellions from spreading and ruining what we worked so hard for during the Revolution. So with the Whiskey Rebellion, he was on it. He was like, we have the Constitution, we have the, Article 2, we have the United States Army. And so he marched in. Alexander Hamilton went with him because it was over his taxes, by the way. So this is an excise tax from Hamilton's economic plan. And they put down the rebellion. Then, actually, it wasn't even like, once they realized that Washington was on the way and the army, they all dispersed. And that was it. No bloodshed. It was a show of force, and it showed how strong the Constitution was. And that's what's significant about it, is the Constitution gives them the federal authority to do that and to put down rebellion that's unjust. And it shows the Constitution is strong. The articles were weak. This government, they're thinking at this point, this is going to work. Checks and balances are working here. Federalism and, federalism is working. And so it was definitely an important event for that reason. Okay, another big issue is how are we going to handle public land sales? This will become kind of more important a little bit later, but basically they start to divide up, because originally, North Carolina went all the way to the Mississippi, and South Carolina had this strip. Virginia went all the way. And so what they're going to start to do is they're going to divide that up. You're going to have new states. Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee are going to be formed in that within Washington's administration. Okay. Very important turning point or precedent set here with Washington's farewell address. So originally, after his first 4 years, his first administration, his first term, Washington wanted to step down. He was tired. He'd been in service for over 40 years between, his service with the French and Indian War and the Continental Congresses and the Revolutionary War, and now president. And he just wanted to go retire. He was tired. But Jefferson and Hamilton both said, no, we need you. All of this was too time sensitive. Things are too turbulent. We need you. If it's someone else, it could all go downhill. We need you to stay. So he stayed. After his second term, I think he knew that his days were numbered, and I think that he worried about maybe dying in office. He did die within a couple years of retiring to Mount Vernon. He only got to enjoy it for a few short years. And he knew that it was time. And he knew that when he left, though, that he wanted to make sure that his predecessors had something to look at. Because remember, he was the first. And it was very important in the precedents that he set. But I think he also felt torn that there were certain things that he was worried about how his predecessors would handle different situations. And so he wrote out this letter, this farewell address, and explained why he was not going to run again. Because remember, there was no presidential term limit. He didn't want to be another King George. He felt that leaving would set a precedent for future presidents to also. So think about it. What if you had someone like Alexander Hamilton be the first president, or someone like Richard Nixon, or even like Thomas Jefferson, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was elected 4 times. But what would that have done, and how would that have shaped our history in a way where it could have opened the doors for someone that would have taken advantage of that office? And so he decided to step down, and he saw some trouble brewing, and he's like, listen to me. Here's my advice. 1, try to avoid getting tangled up in European affairs. So he's talking about the French Revolution, right? He's worried about that political connection. And when he had that declaration of neutrality, this is really important, it really did set a precedent. We did not have any permanent alliances, military alliances, or political alliances with other nations until NATO. So after World War II. And you can use that set a precedent for presidents to kind of be hesitant about foreign powers. Now, the 20th century, everything kind of gets a little different, gets a little bit more difficult. We did join the Allied powers in World War I and World War II, but it wasn't a permanent thing until NATO. Economically, you can still trade with them if they're at war, but politically, stay away, because all it will do is create division. And it will open you up as a nation to, like, you create enemies that way. And we are too young of a nation. And again, we worked so hard to have this independence. We don't want to lose that over like picking sides in a little fight taking place between, like a schoolyard fight. It's kind of like an analogy. So don't make those permanent alliances, stay out of those affairs. The development of political parties really worried him. He said, he avoid sectionalism, try to focus on the union, try to focus on what we have in common with one another as American citizens. Don't be lured into focusing on just on what you disagree on. Try to focus more on what we have in common and what we all want, right? Because different political parties, both are patriots in a way. Right? Both parties want the best for the country. They just believe the avenue to get there, they see that differently. How do we make our country better? One side says one thing, one side says the other. That was what it was like in 1796, and that's what it's like in 2020. They believe in how you get there. That's where the difference is. But if we could focus more on what we want is what's best for our country, then maybe you can actually have there's some diplomatic progress can be made there. And it's interesting because these issues that he's talking about are issues that we struggle with today. What should our role be on an international stage? The political divisiveness as of 2020 is a little disheartening, but keep in mind, don't get too upset about it, because it's upsetting, but it's a continuity. From this point in time, it's something that worried Washington, and it's worried pretty much every president since. Okay, the most is down, and that's why he is one of the best presidents in our history, is because he knew that every decision he made, he was being watched, and every decision he really did toil over the right decision being made. And I think he did make some really good decisions in his presidency. So, election of 1796, Thomas Jefferson does decide to run against John Adams. Now, Thomas Jefferson and Adams, and we officially, you'll notice here, we have some political parties. John Adams of the Federalist era of Washington. Now, Washington didn't really have a political party because they were kind of developing at this point, and they're still developing even as of 1796. Really, at 1800 is when you can say for sure that there were two political parties. Adams is kind of this continuation. He was the vice president, or Washington's vice president, and Thomas Jefferson's challenging it. He said, I think Washington made some bad decisions and I would do things differently. He doesn't quite have enough support yet because it was kind of a radical change and they worried about that change. And you'll see what a big turning point it was when he does win in 1800. Adams wins by only 3 electoral votes. And so under the Constitution at this point in time, Jefferson, from a different political party, now becomes his vice president. And so he's a part of the cabinet, kind of. And the first major issue that happens, again, foreign affairs that kind of tests Adams, is the XYZ affair. The French are challenging those U.S. shipping, just like what the British did. They're challenging the neutrality, and they're also challenging Adams to a certain extent. And Adams plays it cool. He sends delegates over to France, trying to kind of negotiate, please stop attacking our American ships and our merchants. It's hurting our economy. It's not right. Just respect our decision of neutrality. And they're basically insulted 3 members of the French ministers, only known as X, Y, and Z, because this is going to hit the press. They basically say, okay, we won't attack your ships anymore. Just give us $250,000. And it was a slap in the face because the thought was, you're weak. So this is the French to the United States. You're weak. We know you're weak. We can do whatever we want, but go ahead and pay us some money. We won't do it. And anytime you pay a bribe, right, the idea is that they know that they have you and that you'll probably have to pay more bribes, because it's like blackmailing, right? Comes back, they say no. Comes back, it gets in the news, in the press, in the papers, and it creates a lot of anti-French sentiment, right? Some people are calling to go to war with France over this insult. And honor, this is something we'll talk about in class, honor is something very, very important to men during this time period, and they were insulted. And if you insult me and you insult my country and my countrymen, then they want violence. We'll talk about dueling and things like that. And so they don't fight. Instead, Congress responds by increasing the Navy and the Army. So now they're investing more money in a Navy to defend merchant ships. So it is kind of like a little bit of force, not actual war, because we would have lost probably. But it did for sure show them, like, all right, you're going to pick on us, like, because it's like a bully, right? The French and the British were kind of being bullies. So, we're going to up our game a little bit. Okay. Now, they did have to raise taxes in order to fund that Navy. And so those taxes were unpopular, and that'll kind of be a little thing that people are thinking about when Adams runs for re-election. The most important thing when you think about Adams' presidency is going to be the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it does have a little bit to do with the French as well. So the Federalist Congress, right? They've dominated the House and the Senate. They also have the executive branch. They have tripled the size of the Army by 1798. They've increased taxes. There is division over whether or not we should go to war with France. And also during this time, there are a lot of immigrants that are coming to the United States, some from France, escaping the French Revolution, and Irish immigrants who they are kind of like anti-British. For the most part, these new immigrants, this is the most important part, these new immigrants support the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, okay? And the Federalists realize that. And so they begin to start, and they're being criticized, right? A lot of people are critical of the Federalist Party. They are critical of Adams. They're kind of giving everybody a hard time. You have newspapers that are writing articles about Adams and about members of the Senate and the House. And so they start to pass legislation fairly easily, and Adams, for whatever reason, decides to sign them into law. And we lump them together as the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay? 4 different laws here, and it basically attacks foreigners. So that's the alien part. And that's where it starts, is they're trying to silence these foreigners, these immigrants that have moved here. They're trying to limit their freedom of speech, okay? So you have the Alien Enemies Act, which is like spies, espionage. The Alien Friends Act. So basically, if you speak out against the Federalist Party, against the government, against the president, you'll be deported. They increased the residency requirement in order to vote and become a citizen. But the thing that really, the scary one, was the Sedition Act, where if you were an American citizen and you spoke out against the president or out against your representative for speaking, printing, or just being in general opposition to the federal government or the president, you'd be thrown in jail and fined. And we know that that goes against the First Amendment. And everyone knew that it went against the First Amendment. But there was no judicial review yet. So with Marbury versus Madison and judicial review, it basically said, how do you, there was no process to rule this to be unconstitutional quite yet. There wasn't that check on the legislative branch, and it was extremely unpopular. You had violence in Congress. So this is the Lyon Griswold incident. And so if I back it out for you a little bit. So basically, it started out where Matthew Lyon of Vermont, he's on the House floor, and he basically, so he spit his tobacco juice in the direction of Griswold. So Griswold, and this is this honor thing, right? Griswold called it an indecency, and Lyon defended himself with a pair of fire tongs, to get the firewood. And they're basically fighting like in Congress, and you can see the people like kind of laughing on. It was called royal sport. And again, so you're seeing how divisive this is, and this was over the Alien and Sedition Act. So it reveals that there's these political parties are being developed, and that they are willing to hardlining no matter what. Like Lyon disagreed with Adams, Griswold supported Adams, and they were going to do whatever they could in order to support their side. And so, we even talked today a little bit, you might hear like, country over party. This didn't really matter. Like, to me, like Griswold knew that this law was unconstitutional and that it wasn't a good law, but no matter what, he was going to defend Adams and his party. And there will be other examples of violence that take place in Congress. So Jefferson's sitting back and he's watching all of this, and he is bothered by it, especially because he's such an analytical thinker, and he is much more introverted and he's not a great politician. He really wasn't even that great of a president, but he is a mind where when you read what he writes, and he wrote part of the with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with James Madison, is he realized that this was a really important period in our history, and it could be a turning point because of, if you throw out the Constitution, if you start breaking rules to the Constitution, the First Amendment, then you're going to have disorder. And it's just little things that like chip away at the Constitution could soon become bigger and bigger. And so he and James Madison like, well, what can we do to stop this from happening in the future? And so they wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which talked about a theory of nullification. And it's important to understand because we will talk about the nullification theory a lot over states' rights. And it's the idea of like that Virginia as a state, or Kentucky, they realize that law is unconstitutional on a federal level. So even though Congress has passed it, the state can nullify that law. So when we think of like with federalism, that the supreme, like the supremacy, right, of the federal government over the states, like that's it. Whatever's law, federal level is law at the state level. Jefferson is saying, no, but I know that law is unconstitutional. So it's my right as a state to say we're not going to follow that law. And it's a constitutional dispute. And it's one that states are going to use as, when we look at states' rights and we look at the antebellum period, and we're looking at moving towards civil war, and even states' rights in during the civil rights movement, they're going to use, there's this power play between the federal government and states. Remember that Jefferson's view, and that a lot of Americans, their view is still they are hesitant to support a large centralized government. And this is why. The Alien Sedition Acts is why. Thankfully now we have, like with Marbury versus Madison and judicial review, there's that check. But Jefferson's saying like, I told you so. I told you not to trust a big centralized government because these are the things that happen. Even with a Bill of Rights, even with a First Amendment, they're trying to take away your power. And so in 1800, Jefferson challenges Adams, and Jefferson wins. And you have two distinct parties here. They call it a revolution because it was this peaceful transfer of power between, like Adams could have been like, I'm not going to leave. And I know that we take that for granted now, that that's something that has always happened, is that the next person kind of leaves. 2020 is already kind of, there's a lot of talking about, within the context of COVID and voting, and a lot of people plan on voting by absentee ballot, and they're questioning the security of that. There's the whole 2016 and foreign interference and voting machines. And so questioning the integrity of our voting system is something that I hope is not an issue in November. But at this point, people were like, well, is Adams going to leave? Or is he going to use the military to prevent Jefferson from coming to power? Like it was a big deal. And so Jefferson wins. Everything's fine. I mean, Adams did like leave the White House like in the middle of the night, like on the night before the inauguration. But notice here the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. So the red are the Federalists. And see how like the electoral votes are divided up. Like you can see like part of North Carolina, the part that has more to do with commerce and trade, are voting for the Federalist Party. Pennsylvania, same thing. Like you have Western Pennsylvania farmers that are more on the side of the Democratic Republicans. And so that is interesting to kind of see that this was not a north-south divide as much as it was an urban-rural divide. Okay, so that is all I have for today. I hope you learned something, and I will see you next time. Bye.